Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. No matter where you are today, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to the FIT webinar hosted by the Indigenous Languages Standing Committee. Now I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm pleased to welcome today our guest speaker, Professor Jon Corbett, joining us from Canada. Thank you, Jon, for sharing your insights with us, your knowledge, and your lived experience on this important topic, because technology is an important resource in the context of Indigenous languages due to its role in stabilisation, revitalisation, and reclamation of language in this, the UN International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Technology supports educators, students, and researchers in areas such as building open source code, user interface, online tools for language learning, predictive text, and especially in engaging young people in learning and increasing language use in everyday contexts, so vital in preserving language. So thank you again for joining us. I'd like to hand over now to Rula Salam, your webinar host for today. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I respectfully acknowledge that I live, work, play, raise my children, and practice my faith on Treaty 6 territory in Turtle Island, which is commonly known in the Western world as Canada. This place has been a gathering place for the nêhiyaw, Blackfoot, Denisohin, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other First Peoples whose histories, friendships, kindness, languages, and cultures have inspired me and continue to inspire much of the work I do as an activist at heart and advocate for human rights. So I'd like to thank you today for joining us for this important session on Indigitalization, the uncolonizing of computer practices in Indigenous languages and culture. As a prelude, in 1992, Rigoberta Menchú, a feminist and activist from the Quiche tribe in Guatemala, formed the first indigenous political party, the WINOC. And she ran for president twice, once in 2007 and once in 2011. In 1992, she gave a speech. Our history is a living history that has throbbed, withstood, and survived many centuries of sacrifice. Now it comes forward again with strength. So the practice of colonialism is not just a practice, but it's also a worldview. The famous Palestinian-American philosopher and critic Edward Said made that very clear in most of his works. And as Kent Monkman, Canadian First Nations artist, mentioned in an article in 2017, history is a narrative. It's a collection of stories sanctioned by the ruling power and reinforced through words and images that suit them. So for Monkman, history art was a way to reclaim authority over, as he puts it, those moments that have been swept under the rug for generations. From there, as we think about technology in particular, it's often associated with the Western world as part of a narrative that portrays the West as the creator and definer of all things technological that are used over the world. And today, Jon Corbett, our speaker, works on disrupting this narrative. Jon is an assistant professor with lived Indigenous experience teaching at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby, Alberta, and Burnaby, BC. He will discuss his important work on the creation of Indigenous forms of expression through computer-based technology. In this process, he describes as Indigitalization. So, Jon, we welcome you.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, Mio Kizagao. Good day to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Kakaya oma take tapate imoyak equamina kake nanaskomoyak ta epe mama wintoyak otatakot namoya ostesima weasi wewinsik okanagan aski anotes kawichi mama winamak ke bimatisowinao I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people in the interior of British Columbia, Canada. I'm very happy and grateful to do my work on these lands, and I do work at Simon Fraser University in Burnaby and Surrey on the coast. And there are several other nations that occupy those lands that I also would like to acknowledge. Tansei, Jon Corbett, John Michael Robert Corbett Ntsikasun. My name is Jon Corbett. Nia nêhiyaw apatawakosasan. Nia nêhiyaw napeawakwa akayasu. I am a Cree Métis of primarily Cree and English descent. Nokumpan Ida Marie Richard, nêhiyaw esqueo equa nakaw esqueo, Nimosampan James Duncan Corbett Akayasu, Notawipan Robert Richard Corbett, nêhiyaw equa Akayasu. My father and my grandparents on my father's side were Ida Marie Richard, who was Cree and Soto. My grandfather, James Duncan Corbett, was English, and my father, Robert Richard Corbett, is therefore Cree and English. Keta Ayayak Winnipegosas they are all from Lake Winnipegosis in the Paw, Manitoba, which I believe is Treaty 2 in Canada. Equamina, Anokumpan Domka Abramich, Opit Datoweo, Equa Nemosumpan Charles Rufus Hadley Akayasu, Nikowipan Opit Datoweo, Equa Akayasu. My mother and my grandparents on my mother's side, my grandmother Domka Abramich was Ukrainian, and my grandfather was English, and my mom was Ukrainian and English. Kete Ayayak Amiskwachisus Gaganok Wiawao. They are from Treaty 6, which is Edmonton in Alberta. Egwa Amiskwachisus Gaganok Chinia. I was born in Treaty 6 in Edmonton, and I now reside in Kelowna, British Columbia, which is in the interior of British Columbia in Canada. And Tawau, welcome. As was mentioned, my name is Jon Corbett. I am a professor with lived Indigenous experience at the university, or Simon Fraser University, and I am also a professional artist, a professional computer programmer. I was formerly a chef, and I'm an expert in shipping and logistics as well. I'm going to share my presentation now, and we can get started. Sure. I'm hoping someone will please let me know if you do not see the slides or my screen, and I'll just begin. Excellent. So welcome to my discussion today on indigitalization, where I talk about uncolonizing computer practices. And by this, I mean it's slightly different than decolonizing. And I'll get to that as we go through my talk today. And I do this through a lens of nêhiyaw, Cree, Plains Cree, culture, language, and community engagement. I'm going to start my talk today by introducing what I've called an Indigenous computing framework. When I was doing my doctoral studies, when I started that journey, I realized that in order to do what I wanted to do, I had to rethink how I engaged with computing technologies in general. And this led to this creation of an Indigenous computing framework, because it had to remove some of the obstacles created by colonialism, created by forced use of technologies in ways that are counterintuitive or counter to how Indigenous communities operate. And to do that, I rebuilt my understanding of how to look at computer design, software design, the components that relate these together, how they are all related. And I applied my Cree background and knowledge, experiences, and teachings with the design of these in a Western context. And it's important to understand this framework before I get to some of the details. So these first 8 slides or so will take you through some of the undoings of this work, or of technology in general. So overall, what an Indigenous computing framework is, it just uses the Indigenous language and the worldviews of those people to rethink or engage with technologies. I use nêhiyaw stories, histories, and narratives, and I see opportunities of how they are mirrored within mainstream culture, especially within computing. So what are the computing aspects that stand out as being related to my nêhiyaw heritage? And how can these activities be better reflective of existing cultural teachings and story? And at the very bottom line, relationality is the key. How we engage with and how our technologies and our cultures and our languages are connected is important to understand. And we have to remove such artificial structures such as time and money. These two things do not exist within an Indigenous framework, only within a Western context. And everything else is related. And we typically will, and by we, I mean Indigenous people, often refer to the land as our inspiration and the guiding way we operate within our lives, and understanding how nature and lived experience translates even into our digital and technological lives is an important aspect of what an Indigenous computing framework is. This is one example of how to apply this. This is a temporal relationship of technology advancement along with Indigenous temporal imaginaries. So this is one way of viewing time within an Indigenous context, where we start with a future and it moves to our present and then the past, as opposed to the traditional Western construct of past, present, and future. The reason for this is all the knowledge in the universe can be revealed. It already exists. We just interact with it and reveal it as time goes on. And so therefore, in a sense, the future has already been created. The future just is waiting for us to discover it. And we transform from our physical and mechanical ways of doing into these new digital states, which is our current present. And we're hybridizing our relationships with our technological advancement along this time frame, which then leads to in a future context, the past. What these things do as they wrap around one another is teach us about our past knowledge and how we interpret where we arrive and what those technologies mean within the context of this temporal line. And by that, I mean, the way I look at computing today, I look back to when I started computing when I was 9 years old. And when I was 20, I would have interpreted that engagement when I was 9 and 10, and when I first sat down at a computer and I first started to play with it, to say, this is what that experience meant, 15 years later. Then when I was 40, I did the same thing. My current reality, my present has radically changed, but I no longer interpret that past event of learning when I was 10 into that context. It was different than when I was 25, and it was different when I was 40. And now it's different again now that I'm 50. And this is something that's typical of Indigenous communities, is we are constantly reevaluating our past and understanding our past with our experiences. So we're reinterpreting those past events within this context of a future, present, past framework. This is just one. There's many more. A lot of different Indigenous cultures, they view time in a lot of different ways. And it's something that's important to understand in order to remove us from the typical Western 24-hour clock. Everything happens in a linear a linear fashion. One thing leads to the next. What we have to understand is that everything is intertwined, including our temporal relationships, our future, our past, and our present. We often believe happen simultaneously. They contain all of the knowledge within those three things at every moment in time as we experience them. So using that as a springboard into looking at decolonial computing and uncolonial computing, what decolonial computing does is primarily challenge to the political colonial structures that exist within computing. A large part of that is related to language, but there's a lot of power dynamics that are embedded in the computational systems. And decolonial computing is about taking those structures down, removing them, and taking them away as obstacles. Similarly, uncolonial computing is somewhat like decolonial computing. The difference for me is that by critiquing and exposing those biases within the technology, we can create new spaces for rebuilding those technologies using alternative knowledges like Indigenous ways of knowing. And so, in a way, what you're doing is reimagining a technological system, a computer, a device, some sort of technology that is not built on a colonial history, is not built with the relationships that exist within a colonial context. So we're looking at more naturalized systems. And so there's this also leads to a slight difference between indigenization and the title of this talk, which was Indigitalization. So indigenization is about promoting and elevating these our indigenous ways of knowing, our language, our worldviews, our our sacred practices, our storytelling, the way we relate to the world. But indigenizing something can only exist because of colonialism. It is a response to a colonial context where we are trying to reestablish some sort of context or footing within Western world. And so we're bringing forth our indigenous lives, and we're introducing those into our technological spaces and trying to claim a little bit of space for ourselves, but we're still doing that within a Western context. And individualization is more about building relationships that work in tandem with one another. We're braided together these ideas of what is Western and what is Indigenous, and bringing those two together, and preferably not letting either of them take precedence. One does not dominate over another. They share the same space, and they respect the knowledge that is carried between both worlds. And in this way, it makes our computing and our technology engagement more holistic and privileges our cultural practices and our languages. And in doing so, we undo some of these attributes that we have to Western ways of doing that often revolve around commerce, commoditization, time, as I'd mentioned, where current Western technological advancement only happens under the scope of, can it make money? Can it generate a business to be successful? And Western contexts of success are usually weighted heavily on their financials. How much money can they make? And in a indigenous context, certainly within my own, I'm not concerned with how much money can this type of technology create. I'm concerned with what value does it bring to the culture that it serves. That is more important than the money and the time. And that has to be evident in the entire system, not just in the user interface. So in the visuals that are presented are still using Western technologies. We are very cognizant of developing this computer and this presentation that I'm using today are still built in a Western construct. So how do I utilize this tool in such a way that I can incorporate or leverage my indigenous knowledge? And it all starts with language. The languages that we use to engage with our technologies, to engage with the world around us, is the underlying basis for everything. And therefore, it's important that we treat our language with the utmost respect. So just as a way to exemplify why computing technologies are, I'll say, harmful in this case, these are examples of computing language, historical computing language that we've used. So in hardware and sometimes in software, we refer to master and slave. This usually referred to hardware that was connected from one to another, where you had one master device and a slave device. But now we're getting away, trying to neutralize some of these terminologies. In software, we do this all the time. We delete files, right? We kill processes. We purge our trash box. A lot of this terminology revolves around physical violence, and there's different terms that we can use to better replicate what those processes actually are. And then there's other language that we use. Whitelisting and blacklisting have very racial roots. Sanity checking, we use references to individuals' mental capacities. When a process in a computer hangs, we talk about it hanging, or we having to abort the sequence. Applications can also have a suicide, sometimes called suicide applications, which are just applications that execute themselves, and there's another word, execute, to run, and then terminate when they're done, right? They run for a duration of time and then they end, and that's usually a cycle. But they're called suicide applications because they're self-closing. They self-close themselves. But when you have existing language and terminology like this in your technologies, and people are so attuned to understanding these terms, they are adopted as being okay. And there's a lot of companies now, especially in open source communities, that are trying to move away from this type of language and start to approach the computer as being a cultural object, and one that needs to be representative of everybody and as inclusive as possible, and stepping away from these words that can exert dominance and are often violent, imperial, colonial, and have Western-centric notions of superiority, where one item is placed above another. And this is really the starting point of where I started to look at computing, is at the language level. And so when I first started learning Cree, I learned nêhiyaw in what I consider now my home away from home, which is Blue Quills University in St. Paul, Alberta. This is where I went to reclaim my heritage language. And one of the challenges that I noticed is they had a lot of documentation, but not a lot was digitized. So finding, I found a lot of material that's written in syllabics, but not a lot of that is digitized, and I couldn't read much of it. So I tried to, and I'm still working on optical character recognition for Cree syllabics in particular. There is a model out there for Nuktitut, Inuit language. So there are Inuit peoples in northern Canada. There's a model for their syllabics, but there isn't one for Cree, and I'm currently working on a way of doing this. And so these are just some examples from that. But that really wasn't where I started to focus. That was just on materials. So I was gathering materials. I wanted to be able to learn to read. I wanted to write using syllabics, and there was not a lot of digital material available aside from what I would create for myself. And so in doing that, I created my own software for learning the language. What do I need to learn? What are the practices that I do within learning? And two of the biggest ones were converting my syllabics to SRO, so to a Romanized form, or back going back and forth, and looking words up, words that I didn't know. And these two are the main driving forces of this software that I had written. It's just a Windows desktop application. And it just started with this converter, converting text from its SRO representation into syllabics and back again. But when I was doing this as well, different teachers have different practices. Some, when they're indicating a long vowel in their romanized forms, some use a caret on top of the vowel. Some use a macron on top of the vowel. Some don't even indicate those, and they are left up to the language learner to know, just to know what is, if it's short or if it's long. And also just how to pronounce it. So in this software, you'll notice on the left here, I have a syllabic example that's converted to an output of SRO with a caret for the long vowels. In this drop down where it says SRO with carets, it actually has a list you can pick, and you can pick all so that you can get this entire sentence repeated with carets, with macrons, without any, using double vowels to indicate the long vowel, as well as the IPA pronunciation. So if you wanted to know how to pronounce this using the International Phonetic Alphabet, it also produces that output, which makes learning a little bit easier. And what I did was I made it so that you could double click on a word in the output. It would highlight it and bring you immediately to the dictionary. So if you double click on kayas here, for example, it would immediately switch to the dictionary tab in the menu, and it would look up kayas from an online dictionary. And this way, I don't have to copy and paste within this application. I can immediately go from my conversion to the dictionary and look it up. I tried to do this within the context of a little window pop-up that happened at the cursor. The challenge here was the amount of words that would come back. And there was sometimes a lot. You'll get a lot of feedback from the dictionary. So that's kind of where my tools started, and then they grew. One of the other things I needed was to look at the individual syllabics, look them up in the chart. Where did they exist? And if you work in Windows, how do I type this character in Windows without cutting and pasting it from a document? You can use the Windows Alt code. And so usually holding down the Alt key and pressing 5417 will give you the code point for that syllabic. As long as you have a font that can support the syllabic, that's the one that should come out. A little lesser known piece of knowledge that I found in my studies was given to me or shared with me by a colleague on Cree numeracy. So there was a numbering system that used syllabics to render numbers, and I'm trying to find more about this, but I included it here because there was a lot of people that were interested in how do we utilize our language without reverting or resorting to the Western way. Our Arabic numeral system is just that. And so trying to keep our numbering system in alignment with our language is also really important. So I created this little calculator where you can look it up from 1 to 100. You can look up numbers, and our numbers go up to 1,000, and then they repeat. So at 10,000, you end up with 100 1,000s, right? And 100,000 is 100 1,000s. 10,000 is 10 1,000s. Sorry. And so a billion is just 1,000, 3,000 kind of lined up in a row. But how do you convert to 1,079 into a syllabic form? And this will give you that answer. And vice versa, if you happen to have a syllabic form that you wanted to know what the Arabic numerals are, you could do it in here as well. So from this, this was really great. This was a way for me to be able to interact with the system, to work with syllabics. especially in this context here where I needed to look up words, find out the meanings without leaving or skipping or moving to other applications or using a printed dictionary or an online dictionary, having it self-contained so that I can reference it. The second challenge, or of the multiple challenges I encountered, is how do I type in syllabics? How do I get syllabics into the system without using these window alt codes all the time? It's very tedious, and getting to know all of the code points so that you can type them using a number system doesn't quite work. What I originally would do was type in SRO, and I had written some macros in Microsoft Word and Excel that allowed me to translate or convert all of my SRO into syllabics so that I didn't have to find a way of typing syllabics. So I started a journey of creating a keyboard. And one of the steps in that journey was, when syllabics are taught, it depends on the syllabics teacher. Some are taught in a way of, it's a very matrixed system. There was, on the left here is an example of our nêhiyaw syllabic star chart. And I'll also mention here, which I should have actually earlier, is syllabics in our language. Syllabics translate as spirit markers, which means the language, our symbols that we use for writing, are extremely important. They are tied to our spiritual selves. And therefore, they are treated as very sacred objects, right? The language itself is a sacred, each one of those marks is a sacred mark. And so representing them in a star pattern like this, our syllabics occupy the 4 directions. Each syllabic has occupies one of the 4 directions. They're either reflected or rotated according to their positioning. And so you'll sometimes come across these star charts, and this is what they look like. And I went and thought, hey, what would it look like if I turned this star chart into a keyboard? And that's this middle one. And then after I created it, I was excited. I'm like, I think this would actually work. I had a dream a few days after I had created this model, this very first version, that said, if you look at the keys in the center, where I had placed originally the enter key, this big square key in the center, how about just, closing up some of that empty space between the keys, make them the same size. And when I did that, I ended up with this version 2 along the center, where the center became a circle rather than a square, because it looks very square. And for me, it was the realization that these star structure, even though it looks very geometric, very angular, and very square based, is actually a circle. And it's very reminiscent of what our lodges look like, our floor pattern, and our sacred drums. We use these visual motifs of the round circle to mean a lot of different things. And when it supports the language in this way, because recalling that they are spirit markers, being portrayed as belonging to another sacred object within our culture is very meaningful. And so with these keys, I thought, these keys don't exist. I have to make these keys. And this final image here on the right is my 3D keycap design with 13 pole teachings. So there are, depending on your community, where you go, teepees or lodges can have a number of different poles to create them. Some start with a single pole, some start with 3 poles, some have 13, some has 15, some have 17. But one of the teachings that I was with, that they have 13 poles in their teachings. So when we were raising the lodge, there was 13 poles before the hide was put on the outer side around the shell. And when I was creating my keycaps in a 3D CAD program, I noticed that when I rounded the edges, they had these vertical seams around the corners, and they just looked like TP poles to me for some reason. And so I deliberately added poles. So on each corner is 2 poles, and then on each side is a single pole in the center. And on the back side, there's actually 2 poles in the back of the key. So there's 13 poles in total. And what, to me, this was just a metaphor for the same teachings and learnings I learned in the raising of a lodge supports the language. It takes the spirit of those characters, and when they're placed on top, that lodge is upholding that language. And so when you're engaging with the keys, you're actually engaging with the teachings that go along with it. And this is what it finally looked like. Now, I took it a step further even when I was developing the circuit board. I've never done a circuit board before, and I don't know anything about electrical engineering, but I did watch some YouTube videos, and they were very helpful. And I created a workable board, but what was important to me was I didn't want to have, or I wanted to limit the amount of straight lines in my circuit board, because the circuit or the keyboard itself is actually round. And so I want my circuits to be round. And if you look at the circuit board on the right, you'll see that there's a circle pattern. Those traces, the circuit tracings are round. They try to avoid straight lines. And I wanted to do that within a very intentional purpose, because it not only does it reinforce the circular pattern of the keyboard, but I was talking to an elder, a Métis elder, in Eastern Canada one time, and he told me a little bit about the purpose. Like when we enter a lodge for sharing circle or for ceremony, the door is usually at the east side, and we walk in through the east. We circumnavigate that circle pattern. And in Cree, in Plains Cree, we typically do it in a clockwise direction. There are other Indigenous communities that walk counterclockwise. Certainly those that the farther south you get, they'll call it sunwise. And so if you're below the equator, you're actually moving in a counterclockwise direction as opposed to clockwise. But even within our own communities, and they can be separated by only a few kilometers sometimes, they will walk in different directions. And he said the reason for that is if that we all walked in the same direction, we would never meet anybody. We'd be constantly following one another. Giving us the opportunity to walk in these patterns gives us the chance to meet one another and greet as we pass, going in the directions that we were taught through our community. And so I've reflected that in this patterning. And what this actually does is the electron flows in my pattern go clockwise. And so the electrons flow clockwise, but the current flows counterclockwise. And it mimics this understanding of sharing and knowledge transfer. The last piece is the microprocessor is located on the east side of the keyboard. This is important as well, because we'll sometimes hear elders talk about the east is where the sun rises, and that sun is the source of knowledge. That's why we place the lodge. Our lodge door typically faces east. That's where the sun rises. And when you sit in ceremony, that doorway is usually to the left. So the elder presenting or holding ceremonies faces south. So just because the circuit board, you can see the microprocessor is that little square on the right-hand side. When you flip it over so that it's the keyboard side is up, that microprocessor is actually on the left. And this is because if I was sitting in ceremony, or the elder is sitting in ceremony, they face south. South is the top of the screen. And this is another one of those undoing what we've been taught, that the top is north and the right is east and the bottom is south and the left is west. It depends. It depends on the culture that you belong to, and the understandings of direction and how we orient ourselves are dependent on our teachings. And so for me, that microprocessor is quite literally within the context of the computer. It's where my USB cable plugs from the keyboard into the computer is located to the east, because that is, in a metaphorical sense, our conduit to knowledge within Plains Cree, and is a literal connection to the source of knowledge, which is my computer, that attaches this device to the computer. And so it has to be located on that part of the keyboard. So now that I have software and I had this great keyboard design, but it didn't do me very much good in a mobile context. So I'm on my phone, and I'm on my phone quite a bit. I'm not at my computer all the time. This keyboard here, this happens to be my Mikanak turtle keyboard. It's my Turtle Island keyboard. I hand painted it because when I was applying the keys themselves felt like turtle shell pieces. And so I made a special case for this one. And you can see the number pad there on the side as well, whereas the circuit board for this one doesn't have the number pad. But my Turtle Island board, just it felt, it spoke to me as this turtle object. And I have other cases. I have a bear, I have a buffalo, other animals that will tie the keyboard to the land, preferably of the user that is using it. So anyway, back to my virtual language tool design. I had this great keyboard, but it didn't exist in a virtual context. I had this a physical keyboard, and I was hoping there was an easy way to create a virtual keyboard, and so that's what I did. I created a virtual keyboard for my Android. It doesn't work very well on Apple devices, and I'm working on that, but I created it. It worked. It works. It pops up on the screen, and you work it just like you would a normal keyboard. But that was great. But how do I test it? Like, how is there something I could do to play with it? And so I created these little games, kind of like flashcards, where it would show you a syllabic on the screen, and you have to pick and you have to find it, on the keyboard. So you learn how to type. It is very useful for thumbs. This particular keyboard on like on your mobile device, and then I took it to the SRO. So I'll show you the SRO, and you have to find the syllabic, right? You're not replicating the SRO. The idea is to actually get away from SRO, but you should be able to read and understand the SRO as if they were syllabics. And then they just get progressively more challenging. So you'll get a SRO that's a very long word. You have to type the entire sentence in syllabics, or vice versa. Just you're following along. Here's a syllabic word, and as you type along, you're trying to match the patterning within there. I got a lot of great feedback from people that I've shown this to, that have had a chance to interact with it. And some of the best feedback, which is a version I'm working on right now, is when you press one of the buttons, or in the single syllabic version, it will have a sound clip of that item. And so in this case, it would be yow on the left. And so it would say yow, and then you have to type it, you have to find the syllabic with the sound. So it'll actually be sound based as well, instead of being based on visuals. There'll be a sound version of this as well, where it's going to give you a sound clip and you're going to select it using the keyboard. This is actually an interesting part of the story, because this is where my doctoral research originated, and it was in programming. I had written a program that did beadwork I was doing beadwork in my master's degree, and when I was coding, you'll see here on the right at the top, I was using a program application called Processing, and as of Processing version 3.5.4, it did not support Cree syllabics. They came up as these little square boxes, and I wanted to use syllabics. I didn't want to use the SRO. SRO for me is you're accommodating Western language by utilizing the Latin alphabet, and I wanted to use the alphabet of the syllabic alphabet. And in Visual Studio, it now supports syllabics. So long as you have an appropriate font, it will use syllabics. They are not in it's not monospaced, but it does work. However, the commands are still English based in my version, and so I wanted to create a programming language for Cree where I could use syllabics throughout. In this image on the left, which is it's called my ancestral code programming language. Ancestral code is just a short form for Achimo, which is the Cree syllabic version. It means story, and in English, I called it Cree sharp. Because it was a variation. I'm familiar with programming in C#, and as typical, I think, in Western context, especially in computing, giving your programming language an easy name to understand, and it honors that tradition of, I guess, Western programming origin, and so I gave it a name of Cree Sharp. But this is essentially a storytelling platform where you put the story in the left-hand pane, and then you write code in this black pane on the side. And I won't go into too many details about the programming, other than the language itself does not translate between English and Cree in a way that is understandable at a programming level. So when I use concepts like conditional, so an if statement, so if A equals B, then C equals 5. That language does not translate into a Cree context. As a matter of fact, the very first experience I had when I started learning Cree, my first day at school, was the elders teaching that class had asked all of my cohort, this class is about learning the words that you need to operate in your life. So what words do you need to know? And I was so excited. I put my hand up and I asked, so what is the Cree word for computer? I don't know, I figured I'll just go from there, and I could find these words and just drop them in to my language model, and then I'll have a programming language in no time. And my elders looked at one another and then looked at me and said, well, there really isn't a word for computer in Cree. Some members might use this word, Masnaigan Chikastai Pechikeo. I always butcher that one because it's long. It took me 3 years to come across another word that was a little bit similar. That first one loosely translates as a box of shadows where you write stories with no pen. And it's just an accumulation of a box of shadows, which is a television, and writing stories with no pen, or writing stories without writing is a typewriter. And you put those two words together. The current word that I use is Mamtane Chaganagan, which is an artificial thinking. So it's an object of artificial thinking, which is a little bit more in line with what a computer does. So that's what I use now. And it's so, how we represent this language and how it translates impacts how we relate to these tools. And the conditional statement of, if A equals B doesn't come across in Cree in that way. And so I had to rethink about, how do you do these things? And it meant undoing what I knew about programming. And the solution for that is actually I borrowed from a Hawaiian programming group. They use waterways. So they were translating the programming language C# into Hawaiian, and the same logic, that same if-then logic doesn't exist in Hawaiian either. You cannot construct it with their language. So they ended up using the word for river because a river branches. So it branches off into these directions, and you can follow a flow of the river down, so if the river equals 5, then you follow that river. If the river equals ABC, you follow that river. So the constructs become more story-like, more story-based. And that's where my programming language took off. And I did the same thing for loops. So the understanding what a loop is or what a loop does, we refer to our age in Plains, in particular Plains Cree, we age in winters, how many winters old. And one of these reasons is because winters in Canada can be pretty harsh. And so how many winters old you are is a representation of your resilience to the harshest natural elements that you can come across. And so when you do a loop, I say for 10 winters, I'm going to follow this river. And at the various points in the river, the value in my my variable is going to change from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 and so on. And so I don't loop. I don't do, for X equals 1 to 10, I do for 10 winters or for the next 10 winters. That's the language I use in the programming language. And it becomes a story when I do that. And variables are inherently just variable containers. They're just containers. They hold things temporarily. And so I used to use medicine bag, which you can still use within the language, but I also use the word canoe. So canoe, because it just fit with the metaphor of the river, I can put my number 5 in my canoe. I flow down the river. When I reach a point where my canoe and that river equal the same thing, then I can get out of my canoe and continue with the rest of the program. So you explain programming concepts in these ways. It's completely different from the way a Western programming language is explained or taught. And kind of a secondary offshoot of this was now that I have, I've created this language, how do I type it in? Our IDEs, so our integrated development environments, where we type our code, are typically color coded so that you can differentiate certain features. You can differentiate variables from functions or methods, and so they become color highlighted. And I just chose originally colors that were reflective of our medicine wheel. And this was when I had another kind of dream, where it was kind of a dream and kind of inspiration simultaneously of I've often heard since the first day I started learning my ancestral language is that our language is medicine and our language is ceremony. And so it is at the level of that spirit level again is reintroduced, where in using my language, I am celebrating and ceremonially, engaging with my language and promoting my language. And so I thought, if I'm going to use colors to represent my language, and language in this context is our medicine, why can't I use colors of our 4 medicines? And so we have 4 medicines in Plains Cree, which is tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, and cedar. And I went out into my neighborhood and I picked a little bit. I grew the tobacco myself. I grew my own tobacco in my garden. And the sage, sweetgrass, and cedar, I go and pick, directly from the land. And I give back some of the tobacco that I grew. I give that back, whenever I take something from the land. And I brought them home and I put them on my scanner and scanned them into the computer, and then used Photoshop to sample the colors. And so this little color chart on the right-hand side are the colors that I've picked, and the reasons why I've picked them. And then I use those colors as the color palette to recolor my coding window within my programming language. And so here you can see a comparison from the original colors where I just kind of arbitrarily picked the colors to the colors that I used with the medicine colors. And they're each are specific to what they do. And so tobacco is very much the ceremonial, like the action of doing. And so they represent my methods. And the sweetgrass is the color that I use for my variable contents. So it's the current value. What is it called, or what is it, and so on. And so there's a whole bunch of integrations between the colors, as well as their cardinal directions that are also related to one of the 4 directions: north, south, east, and west. So everything is connected. The code is connected. The color palette I'm using is connected. It's connected to the hardware of the keyboard. It's connected to the software that I'm trying to create to help language learning, make it easier for folks to learn our language. And so with that, I'm kind of returning back to the beginning. So my idea for an Indigenous computing framework is built solely on this idea of removing some of these Western constructs and promoting our language so that we can build appropriate tools using the teachings that we have, that are built within community, that are promoted by our elders, and hopefully bringing down some of those barriers. I know a lot of elders are resistant to technologies, resistant to computers, because they do not support, or perceptively do not support our language very well. And I think they can be reorganized and recreated in those ways. And then in doing so, obviously, we're reconciling our Indigenous and Western perspectives. They coexist within frameworks that do not dominate one over the other. And even with my programming language, It's opened up a whole different way of thinking about how do you program. And in ending here, when I say I'm returning to the beginning, because it's very difficult to tell a non-linear story. So a lot of this work happened simultaneously. A lot of it happened in response to others. When I moved from one to the other, they didn't really happen in a linear framework. They kind of happened all together. This is actually my presentation. It follows a spiral pattern where we started our journey in the lower right-hand corner here, and we followed it clockwise. So it goes clockwise around the bottom, up to the left side, across the top, into the center, ending with the returning to the beginning at the center, where we can undo and go back and reinterpret and reanalyze each one of these slides from the context of the knowledge that we now hold. And just so you can see it without all of this stuff in the way. This is the image. So this image is something I had created just walking out, taking pictures of where I was walking. And then I pieced it all together, took pictures of some rocks and put them in there. And the whole point is everything I've presented today for me always connects back to land. It comes from the land. My teachings come from my elders. They come from geographies. They come from places I've been. The land speaks to us and gives us that knowledge that hopefully you recognize in this presentation. And thank you, Ken and Naskomitin. I'm very, very grateful to be able to present to you today. And that's the end of my, that's the last slide I have. So I will leave it there and open up the floor to comments. I saw some hands and stuff go up during the presentation. So.
Jon,
Yes.
I thank you very much. I think people are just still absorbing everything you shared with us in such a beautifully styled narrative that in every aspect reflects the work you've been doing. I myself, I'm still just absorbing it. So we've opened the floor for questions. They will be typed in the Q&A box shortly, and I will read them so we can answer them as we receive them. Well, I have an observation, or just, really just a thank you, from a very sincere thank you. Oh, sorry. For sharing what you've shared with us today. So it's not just a task of reprogramming a tool. It is changing an entire way of thinking and perceiving how we use these tools that we use on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
It makes us think also about how conditioned we are when we are using the computer, how conditioned we are to staying within the margins, literally, and using a very rigid structure, a very linear structure, and doing things this way. This is also reflected not just in what we are doing physically, but mentally. One of my students made a very interesting observation, and that made me reflect on what I had learned from you. He said, when I write, I'm able to express my ideas so well, and I don't have to worry about organization and structure when I handwrite. But when I'm typing on the keyboard using Word, all of this just disappears, and I find that I'm restricted. So we take it for granted, because oftentimes many of our tasks, our academic tasks, our translation work is done through that ingrained perspective, or that ingrained perception rather we have of the software we're using. So thank you again for really changing the way I think personally, and also many of our attendees here. So I guess my question is, maybe since for translators, this would be very interesting to learn. How could we use, and I know this software that you've been sharing with us, and these, the whole process of thinking things through and changing things to harmonize with your teachings, the teachings of your elders, and with the connection to the land. How would you perhaps begin to give some recommendations to other language experts and translators in other Indigenous languages? How could they achieve what you have achieved with the help of tech experts or software developers? I don't know where to start.
For me, because as an artist, so my educational background is primarily in art. I have a Bachelor of Fine Art degree and a Master's in Fine Art, and I'm primarily self-taught in computers. And I'm self-taught in computers because I just did it. I went and I learned, self-motivated to learn, but I learned through doing. And I found that when I go to community, we learn the language through using the language. And so when you're forced into, I guess, structures that intend you to physically do things, we learn a lot better. And I mean, that's very much, the way I've learned. I learned through doing. You can learn a little bit by talking and exchanging, verbal ideas, but it's in the act of doing that I think we really learn to appreciate what it is that we're trying to get across. And so it was definitely something that I was guided through my doctoral journey, is don't sit at your computer and just think about these things. Scrubbing through academic journal articles and trying to find the language that, I couldn't write my doctoral thesis in Cree. The language they are just not compatible. Academic language and Cree Slavics just don't mix in that way. But that doesn't mean that I can't, that I leave it out. And I had to go out. I had to go out onto the land, actually, and look at the natural elements around me and identify, what is it about the place? What is it about being? What is it about, the rivers and streams? I live right next to a river, so I can go to the river and watch it. What is it about those things that are reflective in computing? And for me, specifically, what are those things teaching me about what I already know about technology and how we engage with technology? I think it's a very embodied experience. So I think if you're learning or you want to develop your own tools, look at, how do you learn as a body, right? How does your body learn those things? And then mimic that, like try to create that as a technology. Don't create a software or, within the framework. And again, you're using a language to create a software that's based on probably a Western idea of how language works, or a Western idea of, like the change for me in color. We have color theory. As an artist, I have to go through color theory courses that teach you about color, but color is very culturally dependent on what does color mean in a Chinese context. Is not the same way in a Western context. It's not the same way in a Cree context or an Indigenous context. Colors have complete different representations. And when you know that, so when you're going in and building an interface, you're using the cultural teachings of whatever language it is that you're using through these embodied experiences. And I think for me, that's really been my inspiration, is when I started latching on to these metaphorical relationships. The actual metaphorical part is how we describe it in English as metaphorical. They disappear because they are literally representations of those two things. When you look at Cree language, we talk about our language as being animate and inanimate. Well, that's a binary that we see in our computers, right? Zeros and ones, animate and inanimate. It's a perfect translation. It's not just metaphorical anymore. It's literal, and it's a very easy way to understand that system. And I was challenged one day going, well, yeah, it's fine at the binary level, but when you talk about quantum mechanics and quantum computing, there are states that exist between them. Like there are states that exist between that in Cree language as well. When when you have a toy is considered to be inanimate. If a child is playing with the toy becomes animate through that play, right? And so our language interprets you can have an object that is both animate and inanimate. It depends on its context, which is exactly what quantum computing is this gray area between what's on and off, right, in that binary. It can be a 0 and it can be a 1, but it can also be somewhere along a 0 and a 1. It can be both simultaneously.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting to also think about. No, I don't want to bring AI into the mix because it's a whole new kind of terms, I guess. But it's, when you talk about animate versus inanimate, there's so much more to be said about not just computing and software, but also the development of AI technology and its use in communication and translation. So I would like to read a very nice comment by Rocio Jimenez. She wrote, "Lovely presentation. It also reflects how rich cultures are and that sometimes technology cannot help us imply what we want to convey." Thank you for the comment, Rocio. We have a few questions. I'm going to read them from Georgina Laura Fraser. She wrote, "I find it a very creative and hopeful project. I have many questions. I'm going to limit to a few. One, are these keyboards already being used?" That's a very good question. So maybe I'll let you answer that one before reading the other two that she wrote.
Sure.
Are these keyboards already being used?
Yeah. Yes. Very limited at the moment because I worked on that through COVID, and so the materials I had access to during COVID were scarce. So I ended up with about 8 keyboards. I use one myself on my keyboard, and I've donated to the University of Blue Quills. So Tina Wellman, who I believe is probably here today, she has one at her desk, and there's also one in their library at the university's library. Those are the 2 that I know are out in the wild and available for individuals to use. And I also have a request from a lot of communities right now, probably 200 to 300 from different schools who want them for their computer labs. And so I'm working on those. One of the challenges I've had actually came through testing it with community members was it is currently a USB keyboard. And so you can't use it with things like an iPad or a device like a MacBook where they don't have USB ports anymore. They're Bluetooth. So I'm working on having a Bluetooth chip added to that keyboard so that it can be corded or Bluetooth. It can be both. And that way it will help individuals who no longer have access to USB. And USB is going to go away in the next couple of years anyway. So I think being prepared for that is good. But yes, they are currently active. There's also a Cree community in northern Alberta called Little Red River Cree Board of Education. I've donated a keyboard to them as well for their administrator, and Musqueam, which is a little town just south of Edmonton in Alberta. Their librarian, Manisha, I have a keyboard for her as well. So that will be going out soon.
Very generous. You've been
donating. We're right at the cusp of making it more widespread. But they're created and ready to go. So anybody that had a USB, I can get some made. They're not cheap, but we're working on. There's government granting programs that I'm working on to make it free because I want it free to those language communities, and it's something that I think the granting agency would support as well. And so, yeah.
Thank you, John. So Georgina's second question was, may the virtual keyboard be used in programs or applications such as Word or Facebook? So
Yes and no. Right now I have a workaround. The reason is that keyboard actually exists as an online keyboard, and so it's not built into the device. It's not an application you would download and install, which is what I want to make it. So it'd be a keyboard that would replace your existing keyboard, and you'd flip, from your English keyboard to your Cree keyboard, and that way, then yes, you can use it in your online context just as you would a normal keyboard. It's currently designed to be accessible online. That way all devices can use it, because the challenge I have obviously is Apple and Android are not the same platform. So I'd have to write one for both and maintain both. So the workaround is it does work in the where I have it placed on the web. There's a little text box, and so you could type into the text box and then you copy and paste it out of the text box into the application.
So
it's temporary, but
yeah.
yes, it will be hopefully. I have a lot of things going on in my brain, and so I have a lot of stuff that I want to work on, and sometimes it takes longer to get to them, but it's coming so that yes, you can do it in a virtual context.
Will come soon.
Yeah, and it does work in Word. If you have the window open and I believe if the focus of the window, you can do it in Word. It's difficult. It can be done, but it's a more advanced version, let's say.
Maybe that will be the next topic for the next talk.
Yeah.
So our third question, is the keyboard suitable for all varieties of Cree or variations?
It needs to be tested for N dialect and TH dialect. It works for Y dialect and the variations in Y dialect. So in some communities, what we use for L and R, because L and R are typically not sounds that we have in Plains Cree. And so we have different characters, and depending on if you're East or West, the symbols that we use are slightly different. So it does accommodate those. And because the Y basically changes to N or changes to TH, when you switch the dialect, there is a dialect switch on the keyboard to switch the dialect. So the Slavics are the same, but the symbols that they reproduce are going to be slightly different based on your dialect. I have not tried those. I don't know enough East speakers, or I don't have enough speakers in N and TH to fully test it. But yes, its intent is to accommodate all varieties of Cree, as well as slight modifications for Inuktitut, so that other communities that are not Cree-based or Dene that have syllabics or syllabaries within the Canadian syllabics standards code can use the keyboard. They don't have to belong to the, you can apply different characters to each of those. You can map the characters necessary for your community.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Georgina, for the questions. So we have quite a few questions. Maybe if we can provide I'm being mindful of time, short answers so that everyone has the chance to get their question answered. So Luz Elena Miranda Valencia, if I'm saying your name correctly, says, so Native Americans prefer the circular keyboard, maybe based on their traditions. I see it as a reflection of the drum at powwow festivals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not standard. It's not across the board symbol of the drum, or like I said, the floor plan of a lodge. But it's definitely a symbol that a lot of Native American peoples use within, as an important symbol to their culture and to their community. What they represent within their culture and community is going to be unique and associated to each one of them. But it is something that is also overused as well from a Western context. So you'll see a lot of Western academics create frameworks that are based on this round circular thing without understanding the cultural teachings that go with it. And so I'm very hesitant to acknowledge that this is where it's derived from, or this is what it represents. It is what it represents to me based on my teachings, right? But it is certainly a symbol that represents community.
And it's going to differ from one community to the next, even for the same bigger Indigenous group. Maria asks, Maria del Sigrario Velsac is asking, it's such an inspiring job. Congratulations. I hope there's similar work all around the world on different languages. My question is just about the latter. Are there any other efforts like yours, in Canada at least, that you're aware of?
Yeah, there was a couple of experiments, the wrong word, explorations, I guess, out of the University of Alberta, where they were looking at Cree keyboard design. They tried a couple of different new designs, and some of the feedback that they received from that research was that it was not culturally relevant, right? So the keyboard, yes, it works, it's functional, it does the job, if that's what the job that you're trying to do, but it has no attachment to the people that were testing it or using it. So within the Cree context, yes. In a greater context, so if you look at Mi'kmaq or Inuktitut, Dene, Blackfoot, all of those regions, those communities, I've seen little, very, very little research in developing tools specific for computing. So I'm not aware of any, and I'm always looking for them. So please send them my way if you happen to come across them.
Thank you. Angelica Zetina Gonzalez writes, assuming that we find programmers and people who know how to create these electrical components in USD, how much did it cost you to create the turtle switchboards? The main problem with Indigenous communities in Mexico is that most speakers live in extreme poverty. That's a good question.
It is. So my prototypes cost about $300 each, just for manufacturing. And I'm making very low quantities. I'm making, I made 10. So I spent about $3,000 to make Canadian, which would be, I'm going to take a rough guess at 1,800 US dollars, which is one of the reasons why I'm trying to engage with the government to get a grant through the government to pay for manufacturing, so that communities and individuals, it would be supplied as part of their schooling if they're taking the language at university or in school. It's the same as textbooks, right? You pay your school fee for your textbooks. The government pays for these other materials. And so you actually get the keyboard at no expense to you in order to learn your language and support the language. In Canada, it's a different context because the Canadian government has expressed their desire to support Indigenous communities in language learning. And so that's a bonus for us. I don't know. I think it's going to be state-based in the US, and how it's handled outside of that is a different story. So looking for sponsorship, through corporate sponsorship or language or communities that can pool to help reduce costs for individuals is the other way to do it.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So just very quickly, a comment from Tina Wellman. This is a wonderful presentation, and I can't wait to listen to it again. Hi, Ms. Tahi. And we move to the next question from Alexander, who's one of the members on our committee. You've met him before in a previous meeting. He writes, thank you very much, Jon, for your presentation, for sharing your new ideas on how we can preserve our native language using computer technology. Your holistic view on the creation of digital tools seems to be very productive for creating the basis of a multimodal platform of universal character that can be applied to other languages as well. Am I right in this regard?
Yeah, absolutely. It's intended to be language, I guess, independent, in that it doesn't matter what language you use, understanding the software and hardware relationships, as well as our philosophy in using technology, as long as the target language and community is accommodated in all three respects. That is the overarching goal, is to be able to provide it to any Indigenous language or any language, period, utilizing these kind of three components and making sure that the cultural representation is there. And that's the overall intent. And so I definitely see it as being applicable in any context. Now, there will be exceptions, of course. There's not all languages are the same, and all languages can be easily represented in a digital context. But yeah, I think it can be, and that is my intent.
And I think you explained the foundational work very well. And I think it's a question of gradually thinking along the same lines and applying that approach, by doing rather than just reading about it, but implementing it. And as one does that, the connections start to emerge. I'm guessing for you, it wasn't, and as you said, it wasn't a linear process. It took time, and every time you're learning something new and making new connections as you go. So thank you, Alex, for the question. The next question is from Sandra Garcia. And I think we sort of answered that one. Can keyboards be used as virtual keyboards without the need for a physical input object? So
yes.
In the
works.
works.
Yeah, I've made both. Yeah.
Yes. And Godfrey Mabunda writes, Dear Jon, that was an exquisite presentation. My name is Godfrey Mabunda, a PhD student at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. Your presentation is a convenient piece in my doctoral research in trying to match the Eurocentric computer science. And please excuse me for mispronouncing it. Sheet or XIT and Xitsonga, my native language, African languages. I would love to have your email so I may write to you for your views. Regards. Are you all right with sharing your email with Godfrey and with other participants?
Yes, yeah, it was on my slides. I did make the slides available.
And we'll also drop it in the chat.
Yeah.
Everyone. Would you prefer to use your university email or your...
Yeah, university email, because if it's tied, especially if it ties to academia.
I don't see any other questions or comments. So I guess maybe we'll wait a couple more minutes. It's 20 to 12 on my side. So in closing, I think that what you've shared with us today really is very inspiring, Jon, and not just in terms of the technology and possibilities, but just really unfettering our way of thinking about things that we take for granted and things that we do on a day-to-day basis in so many aspects. So again, we thank you for that enormously. I think for translators, where translators are concerned, I can see this research being very vital to helping them in enhancing their translation. And now, as you may or may not know, in Canada, when it comes to translation, we still have a ways to go. This tool could allow the translator to think in both languages and make the transfer of the message from English into nêhiyaw, for example, or any other language, maybe a little bit easier by allowing the translator to see these connections and think about them. I wonder now, in your work with the elders, as you were always worried about the loss of language is always there, worried about losing language, but at the same time, we are very conscious that we have to evolve the language to allow it to survive. So you mentioned in one point in your conversation that elders are kind of they're reluctant to use technology. How do you kind of reconcile that to continue getting that knowledge and just making them see that it's vital to teaching the next generation?
There's I think a couple different underlying challenges that need to be overcome when working with elders. One is just the generation gap. They were typically, from where I'm from, those elders were raised through, in a lot of cases, unfortunate circumstances, right, related to the residential school system in Canada. And so the resistance is not necessarily resistance to technologies, it's a resistance to Western culture in general, and Canadian culture specifically. There's a certain level of suspect, right? They are weary of engaging in technological cultures because don't they don't necessarily understand. And it is showing in the current generation that these technologies are, they appear to be overrunning our lives. We are so screen oriented these days. Everybody is attached to their cell phone or their device, and it's taking the focus away from what they feel valuable, which is community engagement and using the language. Talk to an individual, don't talk to your screen, right? And the engagements that happen outside of that. And I think that's where the primary resistance is. Overcoming that is really, really difficult. But there are elders out there that are open, who have their cell phones, who communicate, and they use it as a platform for communicating in their language. They just don't have as many tools to work with, and so they try to make do with what they have. There's a elder, Duke Redbird. He talks about elder rhythms, which are the computational expressions of elder knowledge as a computer, as in computing. And I just love that idea. And that's where I'm trying to get to, is if you can convince one elder about the value of these types of tools in supporting the language, they will tell another elder, and you'll start to break down, I think, those the generational gap and barriers between our youth and our elders. I'm acting kind of in that middle ground, right? I'm trying to facilitate that conversation between the groups. But it's very challenging because even my own grandparents were very stubborn, as I don't need to learn that. That's for the young kids, right? And so there's this learning something at an advanced age, something new, and something as challenging as technology is daunting, and they don't want to do it because they don't see the value in what time they may have left in this particular existence, right?
I love the play on words, elder.
Yeah, yeah.
Just the last comment from Rocio Jimenez. She writes, "Thanks. Making language meaningful is what gives meaning to our existence." I totally agree, Rocio. Thank you for the comment. So I think we can conclude our webinar on that note. And again, oh, there's one more comment from Alexander. He writes, "I would like to thank Jon again for a wonderful immersion in computer science, which for Indigenous languages must work on different principles, utilizing particular worldviews, world pictures, proximity to nature, bringing together creative thinking and new approaches to digitalization can lead to finding ways to solve the problems of language preservation as soon as possible. Good luck to you and to all of us on this path."
Hi.
Excuse me. So as noted in the comments, the recording will be available on YouTube, on our FIT YouTube page in the near future. The email has already been shared, and we thank you all for attending and for participating and for your support. And we thank you again, Jon, for the wonderful insight. Sorry, one last question. Angelica Zatina Gonzalez, very quickly, can you tell us about how you approach the community to learn the language? In my experience, speakers are very protective of teaching you their language in Indigenous communities in Mexico, so it's difficult for non-speakers to join in.
There's two sides to this one, and I've come across both. In the U.S. in particular, there is a lot of communities that will not share their language with outsiders, and this is usually related to academia in particular coming into a community and taking or doing their work and then going off and having a a career that's based on the work that they did in this community. They never revisit the community. They never give back to the community. There was no reciprocity. There was no respect. There was respect at the time of their research, but it was self-serving. And that's one of the resistances to why communities won't engage. Learning my language, I have to commit to, it's a lifelong thing. So in my particular case, because my background, I uncovered, or the family uncovered my grandmother's heritage almost accidentally. It came through a Canadian census. So I'm part of a Cree community, but I don't belong to Blue Quills. That is not my community, but it was the only place I could find that taught Cree. And so I asked to have a meeting first with the language coordinator. And then I went to, I presented, they had an Indigenous, Think Indigenous conference, and I applied to that and I presented at that conference. I engaged with their community. And what I offered, instead of coming to your community to learn the language and pay my tuition, I offered an exchange, my technical abilities and expertise in exchange for my language lessons and my tuition. And I'm obligated, or I'm committed to meeting that relationship until I can't do it anymore. It's been 8 years that I've been with Blue Quills. I managed their website. I rebuilt their website. I did it all for free because I get more out of the teachings from community. And so reciprocity is number one. You have to be able to give to community, and you have to be willing to say to those communities, I want to learn this, but I'm willing to do the tough work of engaging with the community, and I'm going to do it regularly. I'm going to do it with the people who need it the most within that community, and I'm going to give the skills and knowledge that I have coming from outside the community and bring that in and hopefully utilize it. And doing that for a period of time. So I spent 3 years working on their website and getting feedback and building and talking and multiple meetings and getting to be a part of their community without, not once did I say, this is what I'm going to learn and this is what I'm going to do with it, and then I'm going to leave. I'm I'm theirs for life, really. I'm a member of the community. So and it's something that I have to live up to, right? That's just the way we do it in Indigenous communities. You give to your community and you ask for nothing in return. And so I'm giving back.
Giving back, exactly. So that hopefully answers your question. Yeah, again, and Luz Elena Miranda Valencia writes, John, excellent meeting. Key lesson, reciprocity with communities that are supportive. Maria seconds that and says that's the right way to do it. So I'm really glad you're sharing also intercommunication skills with some of our attendees. One more question from Alex. Alex writes, Dear John, one more question. How do students learn your ideas at university at Simon Fraser? In which educational programs? After all, the future of the world's Indigenous languages depends on young people speaking their mother tongues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so specifically within our university, this is one of the reasons why I was brought on as a professor with lived Indigenous experience, was to present these alternative knowledges and the way I approach teaching computer science in particular. And so my graduate cohort, so the graduate students that I've brought under, I look for students specifically that are engaged in cultural, in some way with their own cultural backgrounds. So I do have one graduate student who's Jewish, and is looking at, using the same framework I have, but from a Jewish context. And so it's not just Indigenous, but they are also from different lived environments. I also have a new student coming in from Iran who wants to engage with their calligraphy, and the writing system is very similar. A lot of these ideas of sacred writing are very similar, and transcultural. They work in multiple contexts, in multiple cultures. And I myself teach courses in decolonial computing and uncolonial computing. And that's my role in the university, is to offer these different outlets for teaching, so teaching traditional computer science in unconventional or non-traditional ways. So challenging and critiquing what's currently, basically taking that existing curriculum and critiquing it, and trying to come up with a new curriculum that doesn't follow that model. It follows models that are really formulated by the students, because the students are bringing in their own lived experience. That's what's driving their education. And I think, encouraging them to learn their language, learn an alternative language, even if it's, tangentially related to them, is extremely important. I think our ties to languages that are not English, or that are not driven by a dominant language, because in Canada we do have two, English and French. And so if we strive to get to know others, get to know other communities, and align with them, learning their language, I mean, I think goes a long way to just engaging with individuals globally. When I go, if I was to go to Italy, I'm going to learn a little Italian. I need to learn a little Italian so I can get by. And the looks on people's faces when you attempt to use their language, they always say, "Wow, you're, you tried. Thank you for trying." We don't do that in England, in English, like in Canada. If I have a person from China come in, their English is, they're struggling with English, but they're doing their best. No one ever says, "Hey, your English is really good. Like, you're starting to really get the handle on English." We don't do that. And they do that in other cultures, in other languages. They go, they're so shocked to know that you've tried to learn their language. We don't do that in English. We don't do that in Canada. So yeah, it's, encouraging, and just encouraging general use of language in all contexts, especially in, so for me, all of my graduate students are expected to write something about their cultural history in their academic papers. Has to be presented in their language, if there is one.
I love that. I love
yeah.
it. Thanks again, Jon. So I guess just a reminder for our participants that FIT, the International Federation of Translators, is celebrating ITD, International Translation Day 2024, and our theme is translation, an art worth protecting. So it kind of makes you think, Jon, about how valuable your presentation was in connection to protecting the art of translation, because you are creating a tool that will help preserve and protect Indigenous languages, and hopefully be used more widely used in the future. Another thing also, I want to remind participants that FIT World Congress will be held in Geneva in 2025 in September, between September 4 and 6. So anyone who can make it is welcome. There will be a special space and day only for Indigenous language speakers. So I really encourage everybody to try to attend from wherever you are in the world. And we hope to see you in 2025 in Geneva. So thank you again, wholeheartedly, Jon, and thank you, Victoria, who was working on the back end on the technical aspect of things. And thank you to the Indigenous Languages Standing Committee and to FIT, our federation, who made this webinar possible as well. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. And hi, Jon. Take good care and good luck in your future work and research.
Hi. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be here today.